My son Marcus left behind two final messages before he died. One was a will that would expose a terrible betrayal. The other was a video that would bring a cruel woman to her knees. But for his plan to work, I first had to stand at his graveside, lose my home, and endure an attack so heartless it nearly broke me. I never imagined that my deepest grief would be the first move in my son's final, brilliant strategy. It all began just moments after we laid Marcus to rest. The dirt was still fresh on his grave when the cold silence was shattered not by a grieving widow's sob, but by a sigh of relief. Finally, I can rest. Marcus was so difficult to care for these last months. The words came from my daughter-in-law, Isabella. They struck me with the force of a physical blow. I stood frozen, the funeral program trembling in my hand. My son, my brilliant, loving son, was gone, and his wife was speaking of him as if he were a piece of furniture she was glad to be rid of. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through messages completely detached, as if she had just commented on the weather. A few other mourners lingered nearby, their quiet conversations faltering as Isabella's words hung in the air. My voice was a choked whisper. "Isabella, we just buried my son. Please show some respect." She looked up from her screen, her perfectly made-up face contorted with irritation, not sadness. There were no tears in her eyes. There never had been, not through the whole ordeal. The other mourners were watching us now, their expressions a mixture of pity and disbelief. Isabella let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed across the quiet cemetery. "Your son, he was my husband, Charles, and now everything he had is mine." The funeral program tore in my grip. My mind, the mind of an architect that always saw structure and logic, could not process what I was hearing. This was the woman who had stood beside Marcus for 7 years. The woman who had promised to love him in sickness and in health. The sickness had come, and I was the one who held his hand through it all. I was the one who drove him to treatments, who stayed up all night when the pain was too much, who listened to his fears and his hopes. Isabella had been a ghost in her own home, present in body, but absent in spirit. Everything I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rising anger. "After everything he did for you, after everything I did for both of you." The few remaining friends and family fell completely silent. Their eyes shifted from Isabella's defiant face to my own shattered expression. This was not a private disagreement. It was a public declaration of war. Isabella took a step toward me, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss so only I could hear. "You were useful, Charles. I'll give you that. You were the free nurse. But your services are no longer required. Marcus is gone. The house is mine. The company is mine. The money is mine. You have nothing." She looked me up and down with absolute contempt, as if I were a piece of trash she was about to sweep away. I saw the truth in her eyes then. She wasn't grieving. She was celebrating. The death of my son was the beginning of her new, liberated life, a life she had clearly been planning for a long time. She turned her back on me, her posture confident and triumphant, and walked toward her car without a single backward glance, leaving me alone at my son's grave with the crushing weight of her cruelty. At that moment, I felt a despair so profound I thought it would swallow me whole. I had no idea that her final brutal words were not an ending, but the trigger for a chain of events my son had so carefully prepared. The drive from the cemetery was a blur. My mind was a storm of grief and disbelief, replaying Isabella's cruel words over and over. I parked in the driveway of the house I had called home for the last 18 months, the house where I had shared my son's final journey. All I wanted was to go inside, to sit in the quiet living room, and to feel Marcus's presence one last time. But as I got out of the car, a cold dread washed over me, even sharper than the cemetery's chill. There, sitting on the porch steps, were my 2 suitcases. One was an old scuffed leather bag I had owned for 40 years. The other was a newer one Marcus had bought for me last Christmas, telling me I deserved something better. Seeing them packed and discarded like that felt like a final, brutal goodbye. The front door opened before I could even take a step. Isabella stood there, not in black mourning clothes, but in a stylish gray pantsuit. She looked like she was about to attend a business meeting, not a wake. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable but firm. There was no trace of the hysterical woman from the lawyer's office, only a cold, calculated composure. "Bella, "What is this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "What are my bags doing out here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she held up a single sheet of paper folded neatly in her hand. "I believe this will explain everything, Charles. It's a formality, really. Marcus was always so thorough." I walked up the steps, my legs feeling like lead, and took the paper from her. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was a formal document, a rental agreement typed in cold, impersonal font. I saw my name, my son's name, and an address I knew as well as my own. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. Then I saw the clause highlighted in yellow, as if she wanted to make sure I didn't miss it. "The tenancy of the resident Charles Washington is co-terminal with the life of the primary homeowner, Marcus Washington. The agreement is hereby terminated upon the death of Marcus Washington." And there at the bottom was my son's signature. It was shaky, a testament to his failing strength in his final weeks, but it was undeniably his. The paper felt like a betrayal in my hands. A cold legal document that erased 18 months of love and sacrifice. It reduced my role as a father and a caregiver to that of a mere tenant. I don't understand," I stammered, looking up at her. "Marcus wouldn't. He wanted me here. He needed me here. He needed a caregiver," Charles Isabella said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "And you were there. But the terms are clear. The agreement is terminated. As the sole inheritor of this property, I am simply enforcing the contract. You need to leave. Leave." The word echoed in the empty space between us. "Bella. We just buried him. He was my son. This is my home. We grieved for him in this house. We laughed in this house. My memories are here." "Your memories are your own business," she said sharply. "This house is mine. I have plans that don't include you. I've already called a locksmith. The locks will be changed in an hour." Her cruelty was breathtaking. She was not just asking me to leave, she was erasing me. She was scrubbing the house clean of any trace that I, or perhaps even Marcus, had ever been there. It was a hostile takeover of our shared life. I thought of the workshop Marcus had built for me in the garage, filled with my tools and half-finished projects. I thought of the garden I had tended, the armchair where I had read to him when he was too weak to hold a book. All of it was being stolen from me. "You can't do this," I pleaded, my last shred of dignity crumbling. "Where am I supposed to go?" Isabella shrugged, a gesture of pure indifference. "That's not my concern. You're a grown man, Charles. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Now, if you don't leave the premises willingly, I will have to call the police and have you removed for trespassing." Trespassing. The word was a final twist of the knife. I was now a trespasser in the home where I had poured out my heart and soul. There was nothing more to say. The argument was over before it began. She held all the cards, all the legal power, and none of the humanity. Defeated, I turned away from her and walked down the steps. I picked up the handles of my 2 suitcases, the old and the new, and I walked down the driveway to the street. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see the door close on my life, on my son's memory. Standing on the cold sidewalk with my entire life contained in 2 bags, I had never felt so alone. I was 68 years old, a homeless man on the day of his only son's funeral. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and walls so thin you could hear your own heartbeat echo back at you. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, a universe away from the beautiful sunlit home I had just been exiled from. I dropped my suitcases on the floor and sank onto the edge of the lumpy bed. The silence in the room was deafening, a hollow void where my son's laughter used to be. I pulled my wallet from my pocket and took out the only picture I carried with me. It was a photo of Marcus taken a few years ago at a company gala. He was standing on a stage, a confident smile on his face, accepting an award. He looked invincible, like nothing in the world could ever touch him. Staring at that photo, my mind drifted back not to his sickness, but to his incredible strength. My son was a force of nature. Marcus didn't just have dreams. He architected them into reality with lines of code and sheer, unyielding determination. I remembered the early days of his company TechFlow Solutions so vividly. He started it in the garage of his small rented house, a space that always smelled of oil and ambition. He had 2 old computers he'd salvaged, and an idea that seasoned professionals in the industry had called impossible. I would bring him coffee on those late nights, my own retirement, a quiet, distant concept, and I'd listen for hours as he spoke a language I barely understood. His eyes would blaze with passion as he described creating a platform that wouldn't just connect devices, but connect people in a profoundly meaningful way. He wasn't chasing a paycheck, he was chasing a legacy. And he caught it. He built that garage idea into a $70 million empire, not through ruthless tactics, but through genuine innovation and generosity. He became a titan, yet he never lost his humility. He never forgot where he came from, always making time for an old friend, and always making time for his dad. That smiling man in the photograph, he was a builder, a leader, my hero, my son. Then 18 months ago, the world stopped turning. The diagnosis came like a thief in the night, stealing our future. Cancer. A word so small, yet it held the power to shatter everything. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about prognoses and treatments, giving him 2 years if he was lucky. In that sterile white room, nothing else mattered. My quiet retirement, my plans to finally visit the great architectural wonders of Europe, my own life, it all evaporated. My only purpose was to be with him. I packed a bag, left my small apartment without a second thought, and moved into the guest room of the house he and Isabella shared, the house he had designed himself, so full of light and hope. Those 18 months were the hardest and most sacred of my life. My architect's hands, once used to drafting blueprints, learned to administer medications and check IV drips. I became his nurse, his cook, his chauffeur, and his confidant. I memorized the complex schedules of his pills, learned to read the subtle signs of his pain, and knew when to fill the silence with stories, and when to simply sit with him, a quiet presence in the dark. We spent countless hours in sterile hospital rooms, the rhythmic beep of monitors becoming the soundtrack to our lives. I was there holding his hand through every agonizing chemotherapy session, celebrating the small victories, a day without nausea, an appetite returned like they were world championships. There were nights I didn't sleep at all, sitting in the armchair by his bed, listening to the sound of his labored breathing, praying for a miracle I knew would never come. I watched the dawn break more times than I can count, marking another day I still had with him. I gave him every ounce of my strength, every fiber of my being. I did it without hesitation, without regret. It was the last, most important project of my life to give my son a peaceful, dignified end. I did it because he was my son, and my love for him was the foundation upon which my entire life was built. I absorbed his pain so he could feel some peace. I carried his fear so he could find some courage. It was an honor to care for him, a sacred duty. The memory faded, and I was back in the dim, lonely motel room. The photograph in my hand was now blurry through a film of tears. The raw injustice of it all crashed down on me with suffocating force. I had poured my entire soul into caring for my son, and for my reward I was thrown out like yesterday's trash by the woman who should have been holding his other hand. She had seized everything my son had built, everything I had helped to preserve, and left me with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart. The smiling man in the picture seemed to look at me, his eyes full of a life that was stolen far too soon. And in the crushing silence of that cheap motel room, I felt the first stirrings of a new emotion mixing with my grief, a cold, quiet, calculating rage. As I sat there in the suffocating silence of that motel room, my mind couldn't escape the question that burned like acid. How did it come to this? How did the woman my son loved turn into the monster who had celebrated his death? My memory, unbidden, began to rewind, searching for the answer. I remembered the Isabella from the early years, the one with the bright laugh and sparkling eyes who seemed to adore Marcus. She had been the perfect partner for him, ambitious and sharp, a woman who understood his drive because she had one of her own. In those happy, healthy years, our family felt solid, unbreakable. I truly believed she loved him. Now I see I was a fool. I had mistaken her love for his success with love for the man himself. The change began subtly, a slow poisoning of the atmosphere in the house. When Marcus first got sick, Isabella played the part of the devoted wife. She brought him meals, fluffed his pillows, and sat by his side holding his hand while her eyes were glued to her phone. But as the months dragged on and the reality of the illness set in, the performance began to crack. Her visits to his room became shorter. Her sighs became louder. The first sign of the true chill was when she started making excuses. "I can't watch this, Charles," she'd say, her voice laced with a theatrical tremor. "It's just too hard for me to see him like this." At first I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Now I see it for what it was, an abdication, She was stepping away from the hardship, leaving the real ugly work of caregiving to me. Soon her feigned sadness turned to open irritation. The medical equipment that filled the house, the machines that were keeping my son alive, became an inconvenience to her. I remember one evening she stormed into the living room, her face a mask of fury because the quiet hum of Marcus's oxygen concentrator was interrupting her favorite television show. She didn't see a life support machine, she saw an annoyance. As Marcus grew weaker, she grew more distant, spending more and more time away from the house. Her excuses were always vague. I just need some air. I'm meeting a friend for lunch. I have errands to run. In reality, she was running away not just from the sickness, but from the man she had promised to cherish. The true horrifying extent of her betrayal was revealed to me one quiet Tuesday afternoon. Marcus was sleeping a rare, peaceful moment, and I was in the kitchen making some broth. Isabella was in the sunroom, her voice a low murmur on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her words drifted into the kitchen sharp and clear. "We need to be strategic about the listing," she said. "The market is hot right now, but we need to move quickly. What do you think the house could fetch if we stage it properly?" I froze, the ladle trembling in my hand. She was talking to a real estate agent. She was discussing the sale of my son's house while he was fighting for his life in the next room. My blood ran cold. A few days later, I heard another call. This time, her tone was even more businesslike. "I need to understand the liquidity of the assets," she said, "specifically his shares in TechFlow. What happens to them upon his death? How quickly can they be transferred?" She was speaking to a financial advisor, methodically mapping out her financial future, a future that did not include her husband. The final soul-crushing blow came the following week. I heard her speaking in a hushed, urgent tone. "What are my rights if the divorce isn't finalized before he passes? Am I still the primary beneficiary?" It was a lawyer. She wasn't just planning to sell his house. She was exploring how to divorce him and still secure the inheritance. She was a vulture circling, waiting for my son to die. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to expose her for the ghoulish monster she was. But I looked at my son sleeping in his bed, and I couldn't. He was in so much pain already. My confrontation would only turn his final days into a battlefield, so I stayed silent. I carried the terrible secret in my heart, a burning coal of rage and disgust. I watched her play the part of the caring wife when others were around, and I felt nothing but contempt. But Marcus, my son, was a genius, and not just with technology. He was a genius with people. He was quiet in his final months, but he was not blind. He saw her absences. He heard the coldness in her voice. He felt her pulling away. He knew, and he made a plan. I remember the day his lawyer, James Carter, came to the house. It was one of the afternoons Isabella was out with friends. James was a kind, serious man who had worked with Marcus for years. They met in Marcus's study for over 2 hours. The door was closed, and Marcus had asked for complete privacy. I respected his wish, but I felt the gravity of that meeting. It felt final. A few days before he passed, Marcus had a moment of clarity. The pain seemed to recede, and his eyes were sharp and focused. He grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Dad," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Listen to me. No matter what happens after I'm gone, trust James. Do exactly what he says." I tried to shush him, to tell him not to talk like that, but he squeezed my hand harder. "No, you need to hear this. I've made sure she can't hurt you. I promise." At the time, I thought it was just the rambling of a dying man, a desperate attempt to comfort his father. I didn't understand the power, the precision of his final act of love. But now, sitting in this desolate motel room, his words came rushing back, not as a memory, but as an instruction, a lifeline. My son had seen the storm coming, and like the brilliant architect he was, he had built me a shelter. The rage in my heart didn't disappear, but it was now joined by something else: purpose. My grief was no longer a bottomless pit of despair. It was a mission. My son had left me one final task, and I would not fail him. For a long moment, I just sat there on the edge of that lumpy motel bed, my son's final promise echoing in the silent room. "Trust James. I've made sure she can't hurt you." The words were no longer a mystery. They were a lifeline. The crushing weight of despair began to lift, replaced by a fragile but fierce flicker of hope. My son had not left me defenseless. He had left me a plan. My grief was still a raw, open wound, but the cold rage I felt now had a direction. I had a mission. My hands, which had been trembling with sorrow, were now steady with purpose. I stood up and walked over to my old leather suitcase, laying it flat on the floor. I fumbled with the latches before opening it. Tucked away in a side pocket was my old address book, something I hadn't used in years but could never bring myself to throw away. I flipped through the worn pages, my heart pounding in my chest. And there it was, under C. James Carter, attorney at law. I had his office number. I pulled out my cell phone, my thumb hovering over the numbers. For a second, I hesitated. What if I had misunderstood? What if Marcus's words were just a desperate wish? I took a deep breath, pushing the doubt aside. I had to trust my son. It was the last thing he had ever asked of me. With a newfound resolve, I dialed the number. A calm, professional voice answered. Carter and Associates, how may I help you? My name is Charles Washington. I said, my own voice sounding stronger than I expected. I'm calling for James Carter. It's a personal matter. There was a brief pause, and then the voice returned warmer this time. Please hold for Mr. Carter, sir. A moment later, a man's voice, steady and kind, came on the line. Charles, it's James. I've been waiting for your call. First, please let me say how deeply sorry I am for your loss. Marcus was a fine man, one of the best I've ever known. Tears pricked my eyes at his simple, sincere words. Thank you, James. Thank you. I took another breath and told him everything. I told him about the scene at the cemetery, about the rental agreement, about being thrown out of my own home on the day of my son's funeral. I didn't have to edit my words or hide the shaking in my voice. I could tell he was listening to every word. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Finally, James spoke, and his voice was firm with an undercurrent of steel. Charles, what you have endured is unconscionable, but I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your son was a brilliant man, and he was very, very thorough. He anticipated certain possibilities. He paused. We need to arrange for a formal reading of the will as soon as possible. It is imperative that both you and Isabella are present. Can you meet at my office tomorrow at 2 o'clock? A single tear rolled down my cheek, but this time it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of hope. Yes, I said, my voice clear and strong. Yes, I'll be there. We confirmed the details and ended the call. I lowered the phone and looked out the grimy motel window. The world outside was the same, but for me, everything had changed. The fight was not over. In fact, it had just begun, and I would not be fighting alone. The next day, I walked into the offices of Carter and Associates, feeling like a soldier heading into his final battle. The space was the complete opposite of my dingy motel room. It was a world of quiet power with dark mahogany walls that seemed to absorb all sound, plush leather chairs that smelled of success, and carpets so thick they muffled even the sound of my own anxious footsteps. It was a place where fortunes were decided and destinies were written in ink. The air itself felt heavy with consequence. The receptionist led me to a large conference room with a polished table so long and reflective it mirrored the city skyline like a dark, still lake. I was the first to arrive. I chose a chair, my hands clasped tightly on the table to keep them from shaking. I felt small and utterly out of place in my simple slacks and collared shirt, the best clothes I had with me, which now felt hopelessly inadequate. A few agonizingly long minutes later, Isabella swept into the room. She was a vision of calculated victory, dressed in a sharp, expensive black dress that looked more suited for a corporate takeover than a will reading. A string of pearls was coiled at her throat, a stark white against the black fabric, and she wore a confident, almost predatory smile. Her eyes scanned the room and dismissed me in an instant as if I were part of the furniture. She chose a seat at the opposite end of the long table, establishing a physical and emotional distance that felt a mile wide. The tension between us was a living thing, a palpable force that filled the space. Finally, James Carter entered. He was the picture of professionalism in a perfectly tailored suit, his face a calm, neutral mask. He carried a single thick leather-bound folder that he placed on the table with quiet authority. He nodded respectfully to me first. Charles, he said, his voice even. Then he gave a cool, formal nod to Isabella. Isabella. He took his seat at the head of the table. Thank you both for coming, he said. We are here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Marcus Washington. This is a certified copy of the final document signed and witnessed on the 15th of last month. He opened the folder, and the quiet rustle of paper sounded like a thunderclap in the silent room. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The culmination of my son's life, his final words, his final wishes, all contained in these few pages. James cleared his throat and began to read in a clear, measured monotone. I, Marcus Washington, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils. He went through the standard legal language, his voice a steady drone. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Isabella. She was leaning forward slightly, her perfectly painted red lips parted in eager anticipation. She looked like a predator who had cornered her prey and was simply savoring the moment before the final strike. First, James continued, his voice echoing slightly in the grand room regarding my primary residence located at 125 Ocean View Lane, a property I designed and built. I bequeath my home free and clear of all liens and encumbrances to my beloved wife, Isabella Washington. Isabella's smile widened, a flash of white against her red lipstick. She shot a quick, triumphant glance in my direction. I felt the first stone drop in the pit of my stomach. The house, the place I had cared for my son, the place filled with his memory, was now legally hers. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles turning white, telling myself to be patient, to trust Marcus, to trust the plan. James turned a page. Second, regarding my personal property. I bequeath my collection of automobiles, including the 2024 Mercedes sedan and the 2025 Cadillac Escalade, along with all personal effects, art, and furniture contained within the primary residence, to my wife, Isabella Washington. Another stone dropped, heavier this time. I thought of the small workshop Marcus had built for me, filled with my tools. They were now legally hers. My hope, which had felt so strong just moments before, began to fray at the edges. Isabella subtly adjusted the pearls at her neck, her confidence growing into an almost visible aura. My own conviction began to feel like a foolish fantasy. I had been so sure after James's call, but the black and white reality of the will was a cold, cruel slap in the face. Third, James read on his voice an unchanging instrument of fate regarding my financial assets. All personal bank accounts, savings accounts, and joint investment portfolios held at City National Bank, amounting to a total of $2,345,000, are to be transferred in their entirety to my wife, Isabella Washington. That was the final blow. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent gasp. It was over. I had been a complete and utter fool. My son's words, his promise, must have been nothing more than a fever dream, a desperate dying wish that he never had the time or clarity to put into action. The hope that had sustained me for the past 24 hours evaporated completely, leaving behind a familiar, bitter despair. I had lost. She had won. Everything. James paused to take a sip of water, and in that brief moment of silence, Isabella saw her chance to gloat. She leaned forward across the vast polished table, her voice a low, mocking whisper that was meant for me alone, yet it seemed to fill the entire room. See, Charles, what did I tell you? Her eyes gleamed with a cold, malicious pleasure. You get nothing, absolutely nothing. You should have known your place. You were always just a guest in our lives. I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, my throat tight with unshed tears of rage and humiliation. She wasn't finished. She wanted to savor her victory. My Marcus knew who was truly loyal to him. He loved me, she said, the words dripping with a sickeningly false sentiment. He knew I was the one who deserved to carry on his legacy. You were just the help, a glorified nurse, and now you're not even that. You're just a pathetic old man with nowhere to go. I felt a flush of hot shame creep up my neck. I could feel the eyes of James Carter on me, but I couldn't meet his gaze. I felt like the world's biggest fool, a deluded old man who had clung to a dying man's fantasy. The strength that had carried me into this room was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. Isabella leaned in a little further, her voice dropping even lower, twisting the knife with surgical precision. I do hope you have enough money saved up for that motel room. Maybe you should have been a little nicer to me these past few years. A little respect goes a long way, doesn't it? She then sat back in her chair, the picture of smug satisfaction, and began examining her perfectly manicured nails, as if the matter was completely settled and she was already bored. In that moment, I believed her. I believed I had lost everything. My son, my home, my dignity, my last shred of hope. All of it gone. My mind screamed at me to get up, to walk out of that suffocating room and never look back. To just disappear and let her have her tainted victory. I finally chanced a look at James Carter, searching his face for any sign, any hint that this was not the end. But his expression was a perfect, unreadable mask of professionalism. He picked up the next page from the folder, and I braced myself for the final insulting crumb he would announce was left for me. Perhaps a sentimental photograph or an old watch. I had never in my 68 years felt so utterly and completely defeated. I sat there drowning in a sea of defeat, the mocking echo of Isabella's voice ringing in my ears. I was ready for it to be over. I just wanted to leave, to crawl back to my motel room and let the four walls witness my final, pathetic surrender. James Carter had picked up the last sheet of paper from the folder. I barely even looked up, expecting some small, sentimental token, a final insult to my foolish hope. But then something shifted. James didn't read from the paper. Instead, he placed it deliberately back on the table. He folded his hands, and for the first time since we had entered the room, he looked directly at Isabella. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a chess master who had just seen his opponent walk into a perfectly laid trap. "Actually, Isabella," he said, his voice calm but now carrying a new, sharp edge. "We are not quite finished. There is one more point. In fact, it is the most important one." Isabella, who had been admiring her nails, looked up, her expression a mixture of annoyance and confusion. "What are you talking about?" "You said the financial accounts were the last part. There's nothing left." "Not nothing," James corrected her gently. "Everything." He turned his attention back to the will, his professionalism returning, but now charged with a palpable energy. We now moved to the section titled Legacy and Partnership. My head snapped up. Legacy and partnership. What could that mean? James began to read again, his voice resonating with a new authority. "Regarding my company, TechFlow Solutions, LLC, which I built from the ground up and which represents the culmination of my life's work. I bequeath 50% of all company shares, representing a controlling interest, to the man who was my first investor, my first mentor, and my most steadfast partner, my father, Charles Washington." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. I stared at James, then at the document, unable to process the words. 50%. Controlling interest. The company was valued at $70 million. I tried to do the math in my head, but the numbers were too staggering, too unreal. Isabella's face, which had been a mask of smug triumph, had gone completely white. The color drained from her cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. Her perfectly applied red lipstick now looked like a gash in a bloodless face. "What?" she stammered, her voice a strangled squeak. "What did you just say? That's not possible. The company, that's worth millions. He couldn't." James continued, as if she hadn't spoken, his voice rolling over her protests like a tidal wave. "Furthermore, I bequeath the property and contents of the workshop located at the primary residence to my father, Charles Washington, for his personal and unrestricted use. Finally, I direct my estate to transfer the sum of $150,000 to my father immediately to see to his comfort and any immediate needs he may have. $150,000. The workshop. $35 million in company stock. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I felt dizzy, a strange lightness in my head. My son hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't abandoned me. This was his plan. This was his protection. The despair I had felt just moments ago was being replaced by a dizzying, overwhelming wave of love and awe for my brilliant, brilliant son. Isabella was on her feet now, her hands planted on the polished table. "No," she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. "This is a joke, a forgery. Marcus would never do this. I was his wife. I was everything to him." James Carter looked at her, his expression now one of cold pity. "Please sit down, Isabella. As I said, we are not finished." He let his words hang in the air, letting her absorb the full weight of her new reality before he delivered the final, devastating blow. He picked up the last sheet of paper, the one I had thought was so insignificant. "And now," he said, his voice dropping, becoming grave and serious, "we come to the final codicil. A conditional clause that Marcus insisted on adding in his final days. He was very specific about the wording. He looked directly at Isabella, ensuring he had her complete, terrified attention. He read the clause slowly, deliberately, each word a hammer blow. This clause states that all aforementioned bequests to my wife, Isabella Washington, including the primary residence, the automobiles, and all financial accounts, are contingent. They are contingent upon her providing continued shelter, comfort, and respect to my father, Charles Washington, within the primary residence for a period of no less than 1 calendar year following my death. He paused, letting the word contingent sink in. Isabella's eyes were wide with dawning horror. James continued, should she by any means direct or indirect force him to vacate the premises, or cause him to leave through mistreatment, disrespect, or the creation of an inhospitable environment, all assets bequeathed to her shall be rendered null and void. He let that phrase linger for a moment, then delivered the final fatal line, and shall be immediately and irrevocably transferred in their entirety to my father, Charles Washington. For a second, there was only a ringing silence. Then Isabella began to laugh. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a high-pitched, hysterical, tearing sound of a mind coming apart. "That's ridiculous," she screeched. "It's absurd. You can't prove anything. He lived there as a tenant. I have a contract. He left on his own." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The rental agreement, the eviction, the cruelty. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a test, a trap that my son, in his infinite wisdom, knew her character was too flawed to avoid. And she had walked right into it with her eyes wide open. James Carter remained perfectly calm. He reached into his briefcase and slid a document across the table. It was a notarized copy of the eviction notice she had presented to me. "You mean this contract?" he asked softly. "The one you used to make my client homeless on the day of his father's funeral?" He then gestured to a small recording device on the table. "I also have sworn affidavits from 2 other mourners who witnessed your verbal assault on Charles at the cemetery. They are quite detailed." Her face crumbled. The fight drained out of her, replaced by pure animal panic. "No," she whispered. "No." Marcus wanted to be absolutely clear about his intentions. James said, his voice now filled with a sad finality. He didn't want any room for doubt. He turned a laptop on the table to face us and clicked a single file. My son's face filled the screen. He was in his bed, looking frail and thin, a shadow of the powerful man he once was. But his eyes were clear, sharp, and filled with a fierce, unwavering love. He looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this," Marcus began, his voice weak but steady, "it means that my greatest fears have come true. It means that my wife Isabella has let her greed overshadow her love and her humanity." He took a shallow breath. "My father Charles is the greatest man I have ever known. He sacrificed everything for me his entire life. In my final days, he was my rock, my nurse, my hero. The thought that he would be mistreated after I was gone was a torment I could not bear." He looked away from the camera for a moment, as if gathering his strength. "I gave Isabella a chance. I gave her my home, my money, my security. All I asked in return was that she show kindness to the man who gave me life. If she has failed this simple test, then she has proven that she is not worthy of any part of the legacy I have built." His eyes found the camera again. "Everything I have I owe to my father. It is only right that in the end everything I have goes to him." As my son's final words filled the silent room, a testament to his love and wisdom, Isabella made a strange guttural sound in the back of her throat. Her eyes rolled back in her head. There was a scrape of a chair, a muffled thud, and she was gone, collapsed in a heap on the luxurious carpet. The victory was silent, absolute, and complete. The sound of Isabella's body hitting the plush carpet was a dull, final thud. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound in the vast, silent room was my son's voice, still emanating from the laptop, a ghostly, loving echo delivering his final judgment. James Carter was the first to react. With the calm efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis, he walked over and checked on Isabella before speaking quietly into his desk phone. "Please send in the paramedics, and a glass of water for Mr. Washington." I remained seated, my hands still gripping the arms of the chair. I was in a state of shock, a profound and bewildering daze. It was not the giddy shock of victory, but the soul-shaking shock of a man who had just witnessed a force of nature unleash itself. I felt no joy in Isabella's collapse, no satisfaction in her ruin. All I felt was a deep, gut-wrenching sadness for the entire sordid affair, and an overwhelming sense of awe at the depth of my son's love and foresight. He had seen it all coming. He had orchestrated this moment from beyond the grave, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of ultimate protection. James came over and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Let us handle this, Charles. You just breathe. It's over now." And it was. The paramedics arrived and tended to Isabella, who had regained consciousness and was now sobbing hysterically, a broken woman stripped of her pride and her prize. As she was helped out of the room, she refused to look at me, her face a ravaged mask of shame and defeat. Her story, as far as it concerned me, ended there. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, but they were a battle I no longer had to fight. James Carter handled everything. I moved out of the depressing motel and into a small, clean corporate apartment that James had arranged paid for by my son's estate. From there, I received regular updates on Isabella's downfall. As expected, she did not go quietly. James told me she had hired a team of the most aggressive lawyers in the city to contest the will. They filed motions claiming Marcus was not of sound mind when he added the final codicil. They argued that I had exerted undue influence over my dying son. They tried to paint me as a manipulative old man, and her as the grieving, wronged widow. It was a vicious, ugly campaign. But my son, my brilliant son, had made his plan ironclad. James presented the court with sworn testimony from Marcus's doctors and a psychiatrist he had consulted in his final month, all confirming he was completely lucid and firm in his decisions. He had built a fortress around his final wishes, and Isabella's legal attacks bounced off it like pebbles off a granite wall. Every challenge she made was dismissed. Every appeal was denied. The fight drained her of all the money she had left, the personal funds she had so carefully squirreled away over the years. The legal fees consumed her savings until there was nothing left. Finally, about a month after that fateful day in the conference room, James called me. "It's over, Charles," he said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Her lawyers have withdrawn. She's bankrupt. The court has issued the final order. Everything is officially and irrevocably yours." That afternoon, James gave me a new set of keys. I drove to 125 Ocean View Lane, not as a guest, not as a tenant, but as the master of the house. I parked in the driveway, the same spot I had been forced to leave just weeks before. I walked up the steps where my suitcases had been so cruelly placed. I stood before the front door, the same door that had been closed in my face. I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The door swung open. I stepped inside, and this time the silence that greeted me was not empty or deafening. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a sanctuary. The house was exactly as I had left it, clean and impersonal, as if Isabella had barely lived in it at all. But for me, it was filled with the spirit of my son. I walked through the living room, running my hand along the back of the armchair where I had spent so many nights. I went into Marcus's study and stood before his desk, looking at the photos and awards that chronicled his brilliant, shortened life. I went to the workshop in the garage, my tools still sitting on the workbench waiting for me. This was not a prize I had won. It was a responsibility I had inherited. It was a trust. My conflict with Isabella was officially over, not because I had defeated her, but because my son's love had proven more powerful than her greed. Standing there in the quiet heart of my son's home, I realized that true justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. It was about honoring the wishes of the person you loved. And for the first time since Marcus had died, I felt I could finally begin to grieve him properly, not as a victim, but as a father in peace in the home that love had built. My new life began not with a celebration, but with a quiet sense of responsibility. I did not sell the house or the cars. I did not touch the millions in the bank account for any personal luxury. That wealth felt sacred, like a monument to my son's genius, and to treat it as a lottery win would have been the ultimate betrayal. Instead, my purpose became clear. I would not simply be the owner of Marcus's legacy. I would become its guardian. A week after I moved back into the house, I put on my best suit and drove to the headquarters of TechFlow Solutions. It was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, a testament to my son's vision. As I walked into the lobby, I felt a wave of intimidation. I was an architect from a bygone era of blueprints and pencils entering a world of algorithms and code. But then I saw a large portrait of Marcus hanging on the wall, his familiar, confident smile looking down at me, and I felt my resolve harden. I was not here for myself. I was here for him. I took the seat that had been reserved for me on the board of directors. The other members, sharp, brilliant people in their 30s and 40s, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They saw an old man, a relic. They did not know what to expect. I did not give them a grand speech about new directions or corporate strategy. I simply told them the truth. I am not my son. I said, my voice quiet but steady. I cannot replicate his genius, but I knew his heart. I knew his vision. He built this company not just to be profitable, but to be a force for good. My only mission here is to ensure that we never lose sight of that principle. We will continue to innovate, to lead, and to operate with the integrity that Marcus Washington embodied. In the end, that was all they needed to hear. I was not there to take over, but to preserve the soul of the company he had built. My most important work, however, took place outside of that boardroom. I knew I couldn't let my son's name be remembered only for a bitter legal battle. His life was about creation and opportunity, not conflict and greed. With James Carter's help, I began the process of establishing a foundation. It would not be a monument to wealth, but an engine of opportunity for young minds who, like Marcus, had brilliant ideas but lacked the resources to make them a reality. We worked for months drafting the charter, setting up the framework. It was the most meaningful architectural project of my life, building a legacy that would stand long after I was gone. Finally, the day came when we officially launched it, the Marcus Washington Memorial Scholarship Fund. Its mission was simple: to provide full university scholarships and mentorship to gifted engineering students from underprivileged backgrounds. I'll never forget the day we selected our first recipient. We sat in the conference room, the same room where my life had been turned upside down, but now it was a place of hope. We reviewed dozens of application stories of incredible hardship and breathtaking talent. The one we chose was a young woman from the inner city. Her father worked 3 jobs to keep the family afloat. In her essay, she didn't just write about wanting to be an engineer. She wrote about her dream to design low-cost, sustainable housing solutions for her community. She reminded me so much of Marcus. That same fire, that same desire to build a better world. When I called her to tell her she had received the scholarship, her joyful, tearful disbelief was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. That evening, I didn't feel the loneliness or the heavy weight of grief that had been my constant companions. The house didn't feel empty. It felt alive with purpose. Standing in my son's study, looking at his photograph, I felt a sense of peace settle over me for the first time. My son's life had been cut short, but his impact, his legacy, would now ripple outward for generations to come, lifting up others and empowering them to build their own dreams. His love had created not just justice for me, but ongoing hope for the future. Isabella's cruelty had been transformed into an opportunity for deserving young people who would change the world. Later that night, I went out to the workshop, my sanctuary. The scent of sawdust and oil felt like coming home. I sat down at the workbench where my tools lay exactly where I had left them. On the corner of the bench was a small, half-finished project, a wooden model of a P-51 Mustang, an airplane Marcus had loved as a boy. We had started building them together when he was 8, always painting a single vibrant purple stripe across one wing, our secret signature. I picked up the tiny model, my hands steady now. I opened a small can of purple paint, the same shade we had always used. With a fine-tipped brush, I carefully painted one more stripe across the wing. Some traditions were worth continuing, some love was worth honoring, and some justice was worth the wait. My son had been right about everything as usual. Love protects, wisdom prevails, and sometimes, if you plan carefully enough, you can take care of the people you love, even after you're gone. The old workshop was quiet around me as I worked, and in the stillness I could almost hear my son's voice, a warm and loving whisper across time. Looking good, Dad. Looking real good. True wealth isn't what we accumulate, but the legacy we build and the lives we touch. Greed builds walls, but love builds bridges that even death cannot tear down. A well-laid plan rooted in wisdom is the ultimate form of protection for those we cherish.